So I think we're good to start. Hello, everyone. My name is Christina Kera. I'm the Alumni Relations and Event Manager in HEC in the UK. And today I'm glad to welcome you all for this, for the Life Project Festival 2022 closing roundtable discussion today about why activism can bring purpose to the workplace. And today I'm glad to receive you all with three amazing speakers. Shaina Jibraj, who is an associate professor in entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial leadership and diversity at HEC Paris in Qatar. Gwens, who is the CEO of Save the Children in the UK, and Nazarene Bisram, who is head of charities public sector team at Barclays and co-chair of Embrace Multicultural Diversity Network. So today the roundtable is going to last about an hour until 2:30 p.m. Paris time. And now I think the floor is Shaina, the floor is yours. And please do not hesitate to ask your question throughout the roundtable discussion in the chat. Shaina, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Christina. Well, good. I'm not quite sure which time zone you're all in, so good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to the closing session of the HEC Life Project Festival. Today we're talking about work beyond work, and really we're going to be focusing on activism in the workplace and how it brings conversations and actions about purpose into our working lives. And this is perhaps one of the most important topics that has really bubbled up over the last couple of years and continues to grow. Research by McKinsey in 2021 found that 70% of respondents in a survey they conducted defined their purpose through work. And the overlap between work and purpose is incredibly strong and getting stronger. Today, we'll be talking about activism at work, and I'm really pleased to be joined by two guests who are absolutely wonderful in their field, Gwen and Nazarene, and we'll hand over to them in a moment. And both of them are steeped in careers with a strong sense of alignment between purpose and work. So as Christina said, we have Gwen, who is CEO of Save the Children UK, and Naz Visram, who is head of charities and public sector for Barclays Bank, and also co-chair of the Embrace Multicultural Diversity Network. And I will leave them to talk about their careers and their roles, because I cannot do justice to the vast amount of experience and wealth they bring into their roles. So today our conversation will cover a range of areas around activism and also voluntary work, which is now, again, recent research from the ILO has shown that voluntary work is now considered to take as many hours as paid work in a number of countries. So that's a really interesting growth and opportunity in terms of actually how many of us are engaging in voluntary work beyond our paid work as well. And we really want to hear from you. As I said, I've got two amazing guests that will be listening, and individuals who will be talking about their experiences, but you all have a wealth of experience to bring to this. So we really want to make this session as interactive as we can. And to kick things off, I'm actually going to throw out some questions to you, and we're going to do a Menti quiz. And my colleague who's in the room, Patricia, will be helping me facilitate the quiz. So we're going to throw out the first question to you, and we'd love you to share your responses. And my very first question to you is, how many of you are currently involved in a voluntary role beyond work? So if you go to Menti and use either the website or the QR code, enter the code we have for this question. And once you're in, you can answer the question. So I'll just give you a bit of time to navigate onto Menti. And Patricia will just let me know how many of you have managed to log on. And the question I'm asking you at this point is just how many of you are currently involved in a voluntary role beyond work? And it's a really straightforward yes or no.
So 3, so 5, and so on.
We'll just give you a few more seconds for anybody else who wants to respond. Okay, so I suspect a number of you are still getting comfortable with the webinar. We've got a few more quizzes, so hopefully we'll get more of you to respond as we go on with the conversation. But it would be great, those of you who are involved, what your experiences have been, please feel free to share. And those of you who are not involved, but clearly very interested in this area, please feel free to ask questions around this as well. We've got one more quiz, which I'm going to ask you, at least those of you who've responded. It'd be great to hear from you. How many of you have formalized support from your work to do voluntary work? So whether or not you are doing voluntary work within your workplace, how many of you have are supported by your organization to actually get involved in voluntary work? And again, we're back into Menti. Thanks, Patricia.
Okay, they can start scanning.
So you can scan the QR code or use the URL, and there's a different code for this question. And if you want to add any comments to the chat, then please feel free to do so as well, especially if you're having trouble accessing Menti. So this is often, you know, this is where we start to get some really interesting conversations about the barriers and the enablers for voluntary work, and this is something I'm sure we will certainly be talking about shortly as well. Great. Okay, so Gwen, Nazarene, I hope that starts to give you a bit of an idea of who we're talking to today, and just some of the tips and points that you can share as you go through your. We go through our conversation. So thank you to those of you who've shared. And again, I'm sure this is starting to trigger lots of thinking in your mind around what frameworks and support do you need in order to agitate activism and also voluntary work in the workplace, because obviously the two are very closely interlinked, and we'll come back to some of these points later on. Okay, so please, as I said, please keep this interactive. It's we have a lot to say, and trust us, we could talk non-stop for the whole hour and beyond. But we really want to hear from you. So please put your comments in the chat. If you've got questions, put them into the chat. My colleague Patricia will flag the questions. Don't wait until the end. Just throw out questions, comments, and we will we'll stop and bring in your comments because it's really important we hear from you as well. So Patricia, if we can stop sharing. Great. So actually, this now provides me with a perfect opportunity to introduce both Gwen and Nazarene. So Gwen, let's start with you, and perhaps you can talk a little bit more about your role, the organisation you work for, and really importantly, what led you to this role.
Thanks very much, Shahina, and it's lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me. So my role is Chief Executive of Save the Children in the UK. So we're a global member organisation with 30 members from Fiji to Romania to the UK, US, as well as country offices around the world. So we work in roughly 120 countries. And I can see Matthew nodding, because Matthew very kindly welcomed me here and says how much he rates Save the Children. And, you know, it's one of those strange roles where Save the Children is 102 years young, started in the aftermath of the First World War and the blockades on supporting children across Europe. And I took over the role as chief exec mid last year. Before that, I ran the global programs for Save the Children. And it's one of those things that is the perfect role for me, because it really combines my passion for the work. I've worked in international development, humanitarian work for 25 years. And children, of course, are at the center of so much of that work. And also, if you look at demographics, you know, apart from places like the UK, actually, overall, the population is very, very young. And so children are not just those who need help, but also if you want to build a better future, it's about children. So to me, this role combines all the weird and wonderful things I've done over the years, and everything from a love of travel, which frankly was a big part of how I started selfishly. I grew up in a small village in the UK and I wanted to travel. So I started traveling about 16 and never really stopped. But also that feeling that genuinely people are people wherever they are. And I, even as a small child, I never got this idea that, you know, I should only care about people next to me. Charity begins at home, but it definitely doesn't end there. I joined the Foreign Office after university. I studied politics, economics, joined the Foreign Office, then moved into international development, where I found that I felt more at home because it was about putting rights first, and then worked for many, many years for the British government, including secondments to the World Bank, the European Union, time overseas in Malawi, Bangladesh, US, various other places. And 4 years ago, left the government to join Save the Children, because what I really like to do is to focus on the end of the value chain, really. So where does this actually turn into impact? And not just impact short-term, but long-term sustainable impact. And that whole idea, one of the weird and wonderful things about our career is it's about doing yourself out of a job and doing your organization out of a job. And so that is something that I feel very passionate about. Taking over the CEO last year was, again, one of those moments when you think, should I do this? Because I love my role running global programs. But, you know, I guess I had a strong view of where Save the Children could and should go next in terms of truly focusing on long-term impact, truly thinking about how do we actually get even more local, even more sustainable. And I suppose just to add, in terms of the topic here, you know, voluntary work is a core part of our business model. We have 60,000 volunteers globally as Save the Children who work alongside the staff all over the world, including in the UK. But it's also something I and my staff feel really passionate about. And lots of people do volunteer work in their own time, whether it's for us or whether it's for other organizations. We could talk plenty more, but let me stop there, Shahina. Thank you.
Ben, thank you. And I think that point you've made around sustainable impact, it really resonates with a lot of the data coming out at the moment about even millennials really thinking of not just wanting to aspire and hope things get better, but actually want to do things that make things better. And I think, again, that's going to be one of the big parts of our conversation today. And that's why, although we're looking at activism, we're really drilling down into the voluntary part, because that's where you can make such a difference and feel that with immediate impact. So thank you for that. And Nazarene, let's hear from you. And again, a great story about how you've ended up where you are. So I'll let you tell your story.
Thanks so much, Shahina, and thanks so much, Gwen. And yeah, I didn't never plan to end up where I am. I actually studied chemistry as my degree, and I wanted to be a forensic scientist, so that's still on the long-term plan, but I haven't quite made it there yet. So yeah, I'm Nazarene Bisram. I'm the head of charities at Barclays, and I think I have the best job at Barclays personally. I always say that when I introduce myself, because I can see the impact of what I'm doing. And when I talk about head of charities at Barclays, what I don't mean is setting up particular partnerships. So that's very much done and achieved by our sort of citizenship and CSR teams around our partnerships, our role in communities, although I do get involved just by the very nature of my role. My role is very much around supporting charities from a banking relationship perspective. So I look after banking relationships of charities across the UK and internationally, and I run a team of bankers who provide banking services, thought leadership and innovation to the sector. And we have amazing clients like Save the Children International, so the large humanitarian aid organisations. We also look after UK fundraising charities, but we also look after cultural organisations, museums and galleries. So for example, the Science Museum, the National Trust, you know, really real sort of household names that we'll all be familiar with. And my career at Barclays spans over 17 years. So I joined Barclays as a banker, so that's kind of my trade. And I used to look after clients, support them with their business strategy, put together sort of lending applications, help them with their funding, all that kind of good stuff. I'm very much the face of Barclays. And then after I returned from having my son was at the height of the financial crisis, where unfortunately banks were deemed very negatively, you know, huge reputational challenges. And I came back and I suddenly thought to myself, oh my goodness, this is like a completely different world and a completely different job. Where am I? But you know, one thing I like about Barclays is the culture of the organisation and that I work with. And I think that's fundamentally probably why I've stayed there for 17 years. I continued with my role, but then I went to head up our citizenship strategy. So in Barclays, we call, CSR, we call it citizenship. That's kind of the terminology we use. And my role was to head that up globally across our corporate banking business. So I sit in the corporate banking business, which is looking after clients that have sort of £6.5 million turnover, right up to sort of FTSE 100 names. And I was given a big blank piece of paper, and they said, here you go, Naz, there was a real focus on what we're doing in communities, the bank's role in societies. And so I had to do a lot of education across the business. That's where, our climate strategy became a real focus. That's where our partnerships with charities and communities became important. That's where we used the bank's expertise to deliver impact in communities, both locally and globally. And I absolutely loved that job. It was an absolutely fantastic role. I got to travel, I got to work with clients, I got to meet so many different amazing people. But then, as always, you kind of opportunities come along, and like Gwen says, you really enjoy your job, but then you're like, well, this is also a great opportunity, so I need to go for it. So for the past 4 years now, I've been heading up the charity sector, and that's been a really amazing experience. As I said, we see the impact of what we do, whether that's facilitating payments into really difficult parts of the world to make sure aid gets there, or working with a large children's charity and seeing the impact of what they're doing to support young people, or whether it's well-being, mental health. So it really is, every day is a rewarding day. But I also love my job because of people. I love managing people, and I love working with people and helping them to achieve their ambitions. And I think, the point around work life and home life coming together is now even more focused since the pandemic. Our work life is now building around our home lives. The narrative is changing. So I really, really enjoy that. And I enjoy the challenge. I think for me, the three key things are being challenged, pushed out of my comfort zone, the people I work with and the culture of the organisation, and then the impacts, actually seeing the impact of what I'm delivering. You mentioned my role as co-chair of the Embrace Network. Well, I did that for 5 years actually, and that was off the side of my desk. Diversity and inclusion is a hot topic, right, at the moment. All our organisations are focusing on equity, equality and inclusion. And being sort of an Asian woman in the banking world, I am definitely a minority. And so, I wanted to do something about that as well, around how can I help others achieve their ambition, and how can I educate our organisation on the barriers that sometimes ethnic minorities face in the banking world. And that was further exacerbated by the Black Lives Matter movement. So I did that for 5 years. I actually finished my term at the end of December, and now I'm sort of still working, supporting them, but actually working on social mobility and socio-economic inclusion, which again is a really big area. So often that takes over my day job. So balance is really key, right? When you're trying to do these roles and you're trying to generate change. Ultimately my main job is head of charities. I'm passionate about D&I, and I really want to make a change, whether that's to 2 people or 100 people. But getting that balance right has always been really difficult with everything else that goes on in life. So really passionate about this topic. I also sit as a lay trustee for King's College London Student Union, and King's is where I attended. So again, that's given me so much experience and exposure. And I also sit as a governor on a school. So many roles voluntarily within the organisation, but also outside the organisation.
Great, thank you, Naz. And some of those points, especially about balance and just juggling different roles, we'll certainly come to, because there's the sort of the headline and doing all of these things, and then, as you said, sometimes or often it's the voluntary work, whether it's within the workplace or beyond, that can take over, and it's handling some of that as well. And actually, as you were talking, one of the things I scribbled down was this idea about you talked about Barclays and the culture, responding to the environment by giving you that blank sheet around citizenship and asking you to map it. But also then how that opportunity starts to move from being responsive and reactive to becoming more proactive. And that's one of the big things we're recognizing around activism in the workplace, to actually allow the culture and leadership within organizations to start thinking about things differently. So these are bits we'll start to talk about, and I'm going to ask you a question. I know a few things have come up on the chat, so I'll ask you this question, and then Patricia will just pull some of the questions together. So here we are today, April 2022. We're 2 years on from when we first had the pandemic hitting us, and that the world is completely different. But even prior to that, we were starting to see waves, global waves of social change. We think about the Me Too movement, we think about the climate crisis, which has certainly mobilized a lot more over the last couple of years. We also think in the midst of the pandemic, we had the Black Lives Matter movement. And so these are not just linked to the pandemic, but they were bubbling away beforehand. And certainly the pandemic has catalyzed some of this, because we're much more aware of the inequalities and this shared global experience. If we look at this through the world of business, and me working within the business academic space, there's often a lot of jargon and buzzwords, and purpose-driven leadership is one of those big words. And I would say certainly not a buzzword or jargon, but it's something that we need to understand what it means, because otherwise the risk is it does become jargon. So for both of you, you both have this strong sense of purpose-driven leadership in your careers and also the sectors you're working in. How do you see this approach leading to innovation and impact? And again, Gwen, you talked about impact earlier. So how do you see purpose-driven leadership actually going from this sort of big blue sky thinking to being really impactful, and maybe also drawing on examples from your organization? So Gwen, if I start with you, and then Nazarene will come to you.
Sure. So, I mean, obviously, our core business is driven by very, very strong values of trying to make the world a better place, trying to help children achieve their full potential. I think what surprises people when they join Save the Children, or frankly, the international development humanitarian charity sector, is it's a lot more professional than people think it is. So, I've been doing it long enough where I guess there was a feeling that as long as you wanted to help people and you were doing some good, that was good enough. And obviously it's not. Our organization is full of incredibly professional lawyers, economists, technical specialists, risk specialists, financial specialists. It is a profession. And, of course, like everybody, we live in a world of scarcity. There may be 130 billion a year goes into aid, but if you think about the scale of the challenge, especially where we've gone backwards the last 2 years, that's not very much actually what we're trying to do. And so I think one of the things for me is that notion of it's not enough to just do good. The question is, how do we truly maximize that sustainable impact? As I said, I studied economics as part of my degree. I spend a lot of time talking to people about value for money. There aren't many economists actually in the charity sector. And so one of the things we've been working on, for example, to say is, if we have common approaches, which are basically the best evidence we have across the movement of how do you give a child a great education. The problem is, if you can't cost that, how does it work? So, we might have a team and they do a costing and they say, well, it's $200 a child. Well, when I lived in Malawi, the finance minister had $120 per person per year for everything. That was housing, roads, any kind of income support, agriculture, health, education. So coming in with something that's $200 is not very helpful. Mm-hmm. So the question becomes, how much money does he have to allocate per child, including government budget aid, whatever? And then what is the best possible approach for that price? And so that's the kind of thing we're working at the moment. And we're working much more in terms of results-based approaches, impact bonds, that kind of thing, which force you to have this conversation. And it works both ways. We had a funder recently who said, well, I'll pay $20, and say, well, we can't actually do anything meaningful for $20 in the kinds of places we work. So you have that conversation, but you do still have to have the focus on what is the highest impact. I think it also comes in terms of trying to focus very much on the end result. I mean, all of us in management spend a lot of time around KPIs, inputs, outputs, outcomes, all these things. It's incredibly hard. And I think there's something about keeping people focused on the end result. I spend a lot of time saying to people, think about means and ends. Most things we do are a means to an end. They're not an end in themselves. So you may be doing something, you may have signed off a project, you may have signed off a policy, but is it actually driving the end result you're trying to achieve? And, there's great evidence around the mid-course correction, stopping, checking in, what are we trying to do? And are we heading in the right direction is really important. And I think finally, one of the challenges for us is we're pretty good at doing that externally. The challenge we're now trying to do is how do we live up to the same set of principles internally? And all of us, as I say, it's got far more professional, it's got far more compliance, far more process over the last 30 years. But that feels like it's now getting in the way. And of course, we're reliant on donors and others to fund our work. They bring certain requirements. You know, we have to be incredibly professional. But at the end of the day, I've still got people in the moment in Ukraine. I've still got people at the moment in Afghanistan. We do lots of things that are really hard and really complicated. And how do we actually have a streamlined system that enables us to do that? How do we have people-centric approaches? And how do we also, the other thing we have to watch is people can easily burn out in our sector. Because you have to be an optimist to work in this sector. Otherwise, you give up on day one. We have a mantra at the moment around powering possible. We're in the business of powering what is possible, and we believe positive change is possible. But that means we have to also say to our staff, take time off. And one of the things during the COVID pandemic is actually it's the humanitarian professionals who probably cope best, because they're used to deploying into emergencies and pacing themselves. And they know that you cannot be on 24/7. And so actually people who haven't done that kind of work were struggling, because you move at 100 miles an hour and then sooner or later you burn out. And actually our humanitarians have been doing some coaching for NHS leaders during the pandemic who were saying they were just burning out very, very quickly. So it's one of those things of recognizing what we do is a job. We feel incredibly passionate about it, but we have to do it professionally. And we have to remember at the end of the day, we are people, and we have to look after ourselves so that we can do the best work that we can. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I mean, there's so much there, and I think your points about keeping the focus internally in terms of that mid-management piece and really checking in the direction you're going and offsetting passion and purpose with those end results, which sometimes can also be quite difficult to align, and certainly that last point about burnout as well. So thank you for sharing that. Nazarene, it would be great to hear from you as well in terms of what you're seeing, and I know you've got some great examples around innovation and what Barclays is doing in this space.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because with what Gwen does, it's a purpose-driven organisation by the very nature of what you do, right? So if you look at banking, it's like banking was always focused purely on profit, right? It's profit related. It's hugely driven by data, which helps us in fact with the impact that we're measuring, right? Because in banks we measure everything. What gets measured gets done, right? That's what we live by. But if you look at purpose-driven leadership now, just being profitable is just not enough, right? And actually, if you look at our stakeholders as a bank, so we've got our employees, we've got our shareholders, we've got our regulators, we've got our investors, we've got our clients, we've got our customers, and we are accountable to all of them. So what we're seeing now is purpose-driven leadership, and I'm going to refer to ESG here because ESG is talked about a lot, environmental social governance. It's no longer a nice thing to do. It's actually become a business imperative, and actually it's our license to operate, right? It's our absolute license to operate. So for example, when I receive tenders or RFPs on banking, the questions they're asking us now, well, what can you do for us from a banking perspective? But actually, what's your diversity and inclusion policies? What's your climate change policies? How do you respond and help local young people in your communities, etc., etc.? And actually, these conversations in banking are much more broader than just banking. So that's one thing I'm seeing. But why else is purpose-driven leadership important? Well, it's about engaging your employees and retaining them. There's such a war on talent now. There's such a demand for talent. If we don't retain and engage our employees, we're going to lose them, and we won't have that succession planning. We won't get that diversity of thought. We won't get those new ideas. Millennials, for example, they're very driven by social purpose, and we've recognised that in our organisation very quickly, and have created platforms for them to have a voice, for example. But you look at customers and clients, they engage with purpose-led brands as well, and we've seen that. Huge brands that have been impacted by a reputation have seen an impact on their bottom line. So purpose-driven leadership is directly linked to your bottom line, and it's not just about where's the quickest way I can make a buck here. It's about what's your purpose. And it brings me back to that Simon Sinek, who I love, and he talks about your why. What's your why? You know what your what is, but what is your why? And that's what I talk to my, why are we doing this? Why are we creating this banking product? Why are we doing this? Why are we so passionate about this particular client? So I think for us at Barclays, we've seen, it's about license to operate. It's becoming a business imperative. There's this huge war on talent, and it's linked directly to our performance as a bank, right? So, and you're starting to see that not just across our sector, but across other sectors. Some examples of where we're driving, purpose and profit together, I guess. One of the examples I can give is something that we have, which is called the Social Innovation Facility. And it's to drive entrepreneurship. So we get, colleagues come to us, or, my colleagues, I've got this amazing idea and I really want to bring it to life. And what it does is it allows people to bring their ideas that have social impact, but also drive commerciality. Because in India, we're a commercial organisation, right? And it's a fund that we have, and we have a board of, execs that sit on that, and people can bring their ideas, pitch their ideas, and if they're successful, they can get some discovery funding to help them build that product or solution or idea. And we've had some great successes, and one example is our green deposit product, so where clients can actually deposit money with us, and that money's used to fund to invest in green bonds for environmental projects, for example. So there's a direct link between commerciality and climate change. And we've done stuff for the armed forces, so we have great link with ex-military personnel, and created a banking proposition for them because they weren't able to get a mortgage because of their credit history, for example. So where we're finding problem statements but turning them into opportunities that drive that social impact. So I think that's one example. And then, we do give staff 2 voluntary days a year to volunteer. That's standard in our contract. So in fact, give more, really. Line managers tend to say, if you need to go and do that, as long as it doesn't impact your job. And, we've seen that, and people use them. They love to volunteer in our organisation, and we measure that. So in our latest, ESG report, you'll see the number of hours that people have volunteered, what they've volunteered for. And you will have seen our programs like Life Skills, for example, which, is around, bringing skills to the next generation of workforce. And actually us as colleagues go and volunteer in local schools and charities and communities. I could talk about lots of other examples, but I'll pause there, Shahina, but just some examples of where this actually links to our bottom line, ultimately.
Absolutely. And I think, as you're talking, the piece about impact measurements, what gets measured gets done, we know this is absolutely crucial. But also, as you're talking then about giving space and freedom for individuals to volunteer, it adds so much richness in terms of what interests your workforce, what interests colleagues, and actually how that starts to bring a greater richness to conversations, and really thinking about what's ahead of us as well. And that's a really nice segue into talking a bit about activism. It's something I talk about within the book I've recently published called Future Proofing Leadership, and it was one of those sort of small bits we talked about, which is really picked up in the book, and this is why we're having this conversation today. When we talk about activism, we're talking about it slightly different to purpose and CSR. It sort of falls under this umbrella, and it's still a relatively new term. We're not talking just about volunteering, but it's really about bringing your passion and what really matters to you into the workplace. And you've both talked about millennials being much more socially driven in the work, and there is enough research that really speaks to this. So it is an area that's growing in importance, but it's also quite a sensitive one and a difficult one to navigate, because it's really where we see multiple generations in the workplace having very different reactions to activism and what this means. And I just, again, would love to hear from you, your experiences of how you have seen or how you are handling activism in the workplace, and what you've seen being done particularly well in terms of enhancing leadership and career development. So Nazarene, let's start with you, and then we'll come to Gwen.
Thanks, Shahina. So I think in terms of, I'm going to pick up a point about enhancing leadership and career development. I think I'll use my own example as co-chair of Embrace, right? So, I was asked to do this 5 years ago, needed a new co-chair, so I took it up. Didn't quite know what letting myself in for, if I'm honest, but then you suddenly realise, when you're looking at employee networks, it's a purely voluntary role within within Barclays. And I had 2 fellow co-chairs, so we worked together and kind of split the workload. And, we have within the Embrace network, we had a Black Professionals Forum, Asian Professionals Forum, we had a faith network. So lots of passionate people who wanted to drive diversity and inclusion, and we needed to channel that in the right way, and in the form of networks was a really good way of doing that. So we use this a mantra: recruit, retain and develop. So that's ultimately what our networks were there to do, and also to educate and raise awareness so people could feel really comfortable talking about their backgrounds, their faiths, etc. And our network just grew and grew and grew. And I think for me personally, when I reflect on leading that network for 5 years, I mean, that was a completely different leadership experience, right? Because I was managing volunteers. Managing volunteers is completely different to managing people that you pay that work to work. You know, you can sort of say to somebody, Gwen, go and do that. I need you to go and do that. But that doesn't work in a network. You need to inspire them and you need to motivate them. So that whole leadership experience for me was really, really insightful, because I wouldn't have got that any other way. I mean, I know, Shahina, you and I have volunteered in our faith community, and that's the challenge we had, right? How do you keep volunteers engaged and how do you keep them going? For career development, it was amazing because my network is bigger than it ever been. I mean, people say to me, Naz, you know everyone in Barclays. And I said, I probably do, just because of this network. I got to work with people across businesses in Barclays. It's a big organisation, it's global. So I got to work globally with people. And we had, you know, exec sponsors. So I got to work with very senior stakeholders that I wouldn't normally have worked with. I found my mentor through the network. I found sponsors through the network. So in terms of leadership experience, it was phenomenal. And in terms of career development, it's kind of given me access to lots more people that I would normally never been able to do. So when I talk about networks to other people and try and recruit other volunteers, this is what I say. It's not just about doing the right thing and driving D&I in your organisation, which is ultimately what we're there to do, make it an inclusive organisation. This is what it can do for you. This is what it could do for you in terms of your own career development and your own experiences. So I think for me, I always reflect on that as a real great opportunity to do that. And in terms of activism, I mean, look, you know, I think Black Lives Matter is a real pinnacle example of, you know, our Black colleagues, how they felt, you know, in that particular moment when with the tragic murder of George Floyd. And we actually had some of our Black colleagues email us and say, well, what are you going to do about it? You know, how are you responding to this? And those of us, I mean, I was thinking about it, but it's amazing how many people weren't thinking about it, right? Which is kind of stark reality of the world we live in. And so we did set up some listening groups just to hear from our Black colleagues, how are you feeling, that emotional kind of connection they felt, that because that could have been their father, their brother, anyone in their own family, right? And the reality of where we were as an organisation in terms of representation or underrepresentation. And there born was our Race at Work plan, which, you know, I'm actively involved in. But I think it, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement certainly mobilised across Barclays very quickly. We recognised as leaders how we needed to respond. Many of my fellow leaders needed to educate themselves and understand their own biases and their own awareness. And this is an ongoing journey, right? Because it's ongoing. It's not going to change overnight. It requires a lot of cultural mind shift change. And then, you know, other things like climate change and climate action, that's like real top of our agenda at the moment. And, you know, that continues to drive, you know, across, you know, from CEO up. But I would say activism is a bottoms up approach. It works really well. Through our networks, we've been able to change policy. You know, for example, HR policy on shared parental leave, for example, we've just had something on menopause built into our policies. You know, these are the networks. With that activism, they can drive real, if you channel that right way, they can drive real change in the organisation that wouldn't have normally happened. So lots of examples there, Shahina.
Great, thanks, Nazarene. And I think that the point that's really coming out, it is about passion being there and driving, but then channeling and handling that passion, both in terms of motivating volunteers, but also ensuring that well-meaning intentions are actually still delivering to the impact that we've talked about. And Gwen, from your perspective, how have you seen activism enhancing leadership and career development?
Yeah, I think absolutely what Nazarene is saying really rings true with me. And I mean, you know, just a similar journey we've been taking on diversity and inclusion over the last couple of years with a strategy we launched probably 18 months ago called Free to Be Me, which had 3 pillars. And the first 2 were very much about our internal workplace and actually setting out really clear commitments and living by them. And the third one was how do we show up in the world? recognizing that internal, external has to be consistent and has to be coherent, and is very, very much linked. And I think as Nazarene said, internal staff equality networks have been a very important part of that, of helping us to understand people's experiences. So staff blogs have become more and more open actually about what it feels like, both on race issues, but also on disability, on LGBT issues, all these different things. And just that, I'm really proud that a couple of years ago, a lot of people weren't out at work, for example, or, we've had blogs of people saying, okay, this is what it actually feels like to have multiple personality disorder. And this is what I need from you as my manager, as my organization, to be able to be my best at work. A big part of the work we've been doing on race, where we've switched from very much saying this is a D&I issue to saying, no, we want to be an anti-racist organization, actively, proactively. A lot of that has been having very tricky conversations. And we realized that, for a lot of people, particularly white people, they just were uncomfortable talking about it. And that whole issue about, well, I want to be colorblind. No, actually, that really isn't helpful. That is just ignoring the problem. And everything from blogs, getting people to read, not just ask people, because of course, it's not fair to ask Black and brown colleagues to do all the work here, to actually have the serious study yourself, reflecting yourself, having ways to actually build people's confidence that when they raise issues, we will deal with them. Microaggressions are still a big issue that, we're all trying to deal with, in terms of, you may think it's really minor, but actually it is a big issue. So those things, and also Talk and Transform is something we're doing at the moment, starting with our leadership, which is very intense, very open sessions, saying, come on, let's put the real issues on the table so that we aren't ignoring them, because we think this is so fundamental. Otherwise, we're just scratching the surface. And we're making sure all our exec team, all our corporate leadership team do that. I guess in terms of some of the challenges is that, we have staff networks, as Nazarene says, they're volunteers, they're very active, plenty of challenge on all sorts of issues. At the same time, we have a professional D&I team, a director and 2 staff. And, there are times when, of course, we're going to say no as an organization. It may be no, it may be that's not for us as Save the Children, because actually we can't be all things to everybody. It may be no, not now, or not in that way. And so, making sure that we actually work with the D&I team who help us to set policy and practice, so it doesn't become a free-for-all, and also so we can manage expectations. Yeah. We have to balance what we're doing for children, and we have to balance our cost. Fundamentally, it's my job to make sure that we are maximizing that impact for children, and the bulk of our resources are helping children. So these things are really important. How do you make sure you match those 2 things, but understanding that...
Attention. This is a fire service evacuation announcement. Please leave the building.
Okay, sorry about that. That was a fire drill. We're not running anywhere, don't worry.
Drill? Okay,
sorry.
No, but just to say, I think as that the central premise that the gap between inside and outside, just that really isn't a gap anymore. And yeah. I think for me, one of the key things is, 30 years ago when I first did leadership training, the sense that managing people was about managing people to do their best work 9 to 5 and then go home is just gone. Yeah. And I think it's great that millennials have put it on the table, but I think many of us felt it from day one anyway. And the nice thing is now we actually do talk about it much more.
And can I just add, sorry, Shahina, to that public and private coming together as well. I think that's SDG number 17, if I'm right. I think, we're trying to fill the gaps perhaps where government can't. And I think, the pandemic saw that, right, where corporations and charities was just stepping in to support communities, to really help people through this really difficult time. And I think that, to me, is a long-term strategy and a strategy for success.
Absolutely. And wearing my academic hat as a professor of innovation, entrepreneurial leadership and diversity, it's no surprise these areas come together, because to have really strong innovation, you need diversity of experience and thought coming through. And actually, one of the most critical foundations in leadership to nurture entrepreneurial thinking, whether it's as a startup or in an entrepreneurial perspective, it's about listening, it's about being curious. It's not about assuming that you've got the right answer and you shut down the conversation. And yet one of the biggest challenges we see around leadership is this sense that historically leaders have been expected to have all the answers in front of them and just present them. And certainly the pandemic really threw that into disarray, because absolutely everybody was dealing with something new with incomplete information. There was no blueprint. And so what we saw was that, especially even at country level, the leaders that were particularly successful were the ones who were collaborative, and therefore by being collaborative were much more open and innovative to solutions. So when you are talking about the difficult conversations, the listening labs, the finding ways for colleagues to feel more open and expressing themselves, it's not just paying lip service, it's actually really taking that and especially allowing senior leaders to get comfortable with saying, we don't have the answers, tell us. We're not going to come back immediately with the responses, but we need to listen. And this is exciting in the leadership space, because we're seeing a very new model of leadership emerging, and we now have some examples of good practice and how that works. I am very conscious about time, and hopefully another fire drill won't send us out of the room. But Matthew, there's a question for you, and it takes us back a little bit to what was being shared earlier from Gwen and Nazarene. And you ask about maximizing sustainable impact. And your question is, how do you coordinate short-term actions and quick projects around infrastructure, health, and so on with a long-term perspective? And we know particularly the areas you're working in, both of you, Nazarene and Gwen, there is always that tension between what is short-term impactful alongside long-term perspective. So if I can take short responses from both of you on this. So Gwen, shall we start with you, and then Nazarene will come to you?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it's something we work on a lot. I think, as I say, it comes back to this idea of where are you ultimately trying to get to? So our goals are very much grounded in the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. We have a set of goals as an organisation that all children will survive, they'll get a great quality education, and they'll be protected. And so we keep those as our kind of guiding star, if you like, of where we're trying to get to. But you do have to make trade-offs. And so I think it is thinking about, like, you know, somewhere like Yemen, today we're doing emergency humanitarian support. Ultimately, the solution is peace in Yemen. And so we work on both of those two things at the same time. And so I think it's been very, very clear about, as I say, means to an end. And I think just a final point just to pick up is this partnerships point. And, you know, Nazarene said, you know, she's working with Save the Children. We're really proud of those corporate partnerships we have. And I think, you know, I was part of the SDG work, and I do think that focus on partnerships is so fundamental, because none of us have actually got the solutions. And, you know, again, there's things we do short term, but long term, the extent to which governments, corporates, other people are taking up the issues, that's success. And that is ultimately where we need to get to. So really enhancing other people's skills, partnerships, collaboration is the key thing all of us need to do far better.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head, Gwen. And I mean, look, I work in a bank, you know, you're constantly balancing short-termism with the long-term impact. So, but if you look at our climate change strategy, you know, we've committed to be net zero by 2050. Now, that's not going to happen overnight. There's a lot that the bank has to do. We're already net zero in our own operations as a bank, but we work with so many different clients in so many different sectors. And so they are on a transition, and we have to take them on a journey. We can't just sort of turn off the finance, so to speak, which is challenging, right? Because we're challenged on that all the time. But there are things that we can do immediately around our policies, around the environment, etc., which we mobilise very quickly, balanced with the fact that we work globally across many different sectors. And how do we work with those different sectors to get to that net zero goal? Just that as an example, but it's challenging.
Great, thank you. So so apologies, Jean-Christophe, that was your question, which I incorrectly attributed to Matthew. But Matthew, I have a question from you, which is a very big blue sky question, but I'm going to ask it. What do you believe is the key aspect missing that the world needs, and how can we achieve it? Nazarene, you're ready to go with that answer.
No, I'm not. I was going to say, I think emotional intelligence, you know, EQ for me is, you know, much as we love the IQ and the technical skills as a leader and, you know, the leadership skills, I think EQ is definitely needed. But I think diversity, I mean, you just have to look, I'm not going to go into politics, but politicians around the world and where we are as a world, diversity, you know, voices around that table and equality is a real challenge at the moment. So for me, you know, that's a really big, deep question around, but that kind of pluralism, which you talk about, Shahina, so eloquently in all your articles, but that just respect and acknowledgement and respecting difference and using it to mobilize change rather than using it as a way of hindering change, for me is the thing. And I just look, when I look around tables, when I look around the world, I think we just need more voices around that table for sure.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think I would just add on to that. I mean, this long-term perspective matters. I mean, on climate change at the moment, we're seeing, of course, with what's happening in Ukraine and everything, a very, very short-term focus on how do we deal with fuel price. I mean, we work on UK poverty, and of course, the prices of heating and so on is a massive issue. But we know, we've just got the recent IPCC report, we have to reduce reliance on fossil fuels. Otherwise, climate change is going to be the end of the earth, frankly. And so I think that long-term perspective is something for all of us, that should inform your short-term decisions. And how do you actually do that critical path to where you're trying to get to? There's too much short-termism today, I think. And actually, in some ways, I was talking to a colleague recently, and we were speculating whether businesses are probably now longer term than politicians. And all of us need a longer term perspective.
The fact that all three of us just laughed, that just made it gold to me. Thank you so much for answering.
No, thank you, Matthew. It's a great question. And, you just have to look at the Ukraine crisis and think if we had been addressing some of these issues around energy, we may not be in the situation we are now. So we hear about these things, we've watched films about them. I mean, they are big, big parts of our narrative for decades. And yet actually that shift from fiction and stories and sort of this big blue sky piece to actually what it means for us is so critical right now. And we're talking about climate change, we're talking about the impact of AI. These are all huge areas, and everything you've talked about really underpins how we handle and understand these areas. And Nazarene, just to your point about politics and political leadership, I mentioned to you, the evidence around COVID. I will just throw this out. In the first 6 months of COVID, when we were all grappling to try and understand what this meant, there was some great research, and I did write about this in one of my Forbes articles, that the countries that performed better were run by female leaders. And this was, even when you take into account population sizes, but compared to their neighbors and comparative countries, they were run by women. And we're not just talking about the obvious ones such as New Zealand, but across the board, these countries were run better because in the absence of a clear answer and a clear roadmap, collaboration became the way forward. So the good news is, at least back to the point about data and numerics, there is evidence now which actually explains why there's a stronger case for diversity and leadership as well. Okay, so I've got 2 more questions I want to ask you. The first one, we're talking about activism and volunteering in a very positive way. We know it brings lots of value and strength into leadership, into careers, and you've given such fantastic examples. But there is a potential cynical and darker side to this, where there are individuals, and especially in today's world, where people are feeling so overwhelmed and they just want to go and do their job, switch off at whatever point they can and focus on family and other things that really matter to them. And sometimes there's a risk, especially where people are very passionate about areas, that they can overwhelm their teams or colleagues around them around the activism piece. And if I'm working in a team and I don't really want to deal with the activism piece, I feel compelled to do it because it's important for my career and I've got to be seen to be doing it. We're starting to think about this in the darker side of activism, and I don't want this to become the overriding factor, but we need to balance this. So again, what are your views on this? Again, maybe you've seen or had experience of this, or how do you balance it within your teams? Because there is this very real pushback from individuals who do feel overwhelmed at the moment, or frankly, just don't want to get involved. Gwen, would you like to jump in?
So maybe just to give a couple of light-hearted examples from my world, but I think it's quite telling of, and it's something we joke about of, so within an organization like Save the Children, you have different teams and you have different cultures within the teams. So, we have people who are professional campaigners who, on a bad day will campaign internally. And that can be quite exhausting as a leader, frankly, because they're very, very good at campaigning. Or similarly, if you're a humanitarian, you realize that every hour counts, every minute counts. And so, when I joined, people said to me, yeah, your team are the kind of, they call them the technical terrorists, I think, of kind of, when you ask them to fill in a form, they're like, but children might die in the meantime. And of course, as I say, we have to have proper control frameworks, we have to have proper processes. But it is that thing about people-centric approaches that focus on the end goal, that say we do need a robust control framework, but what is the minimal viable product that actually does that and enables us all to do the best job that we can. And I think it is something about recognizing within an organization that people are people. We all have different motivations. You know, we have very generous parental leave for a good reason, because otherwise we couldn't really be Save the Children, and actually living up to that value. You know, and I always say to people, I became my most productive when I worked part-time, when my kids were young. And that forced me to think about the value of every time I spend in work. I spend a lot of time during the week thinking about work, but I'm quite strict on not working at the weekend unless I am dealing with a crisis, because otherwise come Monday morning, I'm grumpy and I'm not very good at then focusing on the week ahead. So I think you do need to set your personal limits and remember that we are one team ultimately.
Great, thank you. And Nazarene?
Yeah, I mean, look, I totally agree with that. I mean, it's not for everyone, and there's no point doing something for the sake of it because it's not authentic. It doesn't come from the right place, and actually might deliver a negative impact overall, right? Especially if you're volunteering or, you know, we see this a lot with D&I. Unfortunately, people use it as a profile piece or, you know, to get recognised, and that not necessarily works out in the right way. I agree with Gwen. I'm the same. You know, one of the best pieces of advice that one of my former bosses gave me, and she said, "You can have it all, Naz, but not at the same time. And at different stages of your life, different things take priority. And if family is your priority, as it is for probably all of us, then so be it, right? You know, there'll be different times where you can do different things. And I think about activism. We think of this kind of, I'm going to change the world and the world's going to be green by next year and there's going to be 10 black people sitting on my board. Like, we know realistically that's not going to happen. It's about what you do to the person next to you, how you impact them. Because I always talk about this ripple effect. You know, if I can help somebody, the person sitting next to me, and he or she feels great about themselves, that will transcend across my team and the organisation. So activism doesn't have to be these broad statements of volunteering and whatever. It can be just the smallest things that you do in your job that can make a difference to the person and you don't even realise it.
Great, thank you. And I can say, having had the pleasure of knowing Gwen for 4 years, and actually working with Naz for 4 years, we've known each other for 7 years now, that ripple effect she talks about, I have been on the receiving end of it. She walks the talk, and the work I've done with Gwen is exactly the same. So it's been an absolute pleasure and privilege to have you with us. I'm just checking, I don't think we have any other questions.
Yes,
do we?
Yeah, I think just start. Is it easy to keep volunteering for the same organization, charity, when you move to another employer? Is this challenge you need to discuss, negotiate with your next employer?
Okay, so it's a very, very practical question from Christoph about when you've set up the practice of volunteering with your current employee and then you shift, how do you negotiate that with your new job? So Nazarene, let's hear from you on that. And
yeah, I mean, having had to do that for 17 years, volunteering, I think, is part of our DNA. But I think it's, you know, being really open and honest. I think that the key thing around your line manager or is trust, right? And that's, for me, our relationships are all built on trust. So, you know, I've had people who've come for interview. In fact, I'm interviewing at the moment for a secondment in my team, and a couple of people in the organisation reached out to me. And one of the young ladies that reached out to me, she said, "I'm really passionate about well-being." And she runs lots of well-being events. And she says, if I'm successful in the role, will I still be able to do what I enjoy? And absolutely, you know, I won't go into the detailed conversation that we had, but she asked me that outright, right? That's important to her. And it's really important for me as a leader to recognise that's important to her. So how can I make it work for her? So I think if I was moving to another organisation, I'd be very open and clear about my external board roles, and I would understand the impact that it may have. And I would also explain to my employer how I plan to balance it and manage my time, because ultimately what I'm paid to do is head of charities, and I do these other things voluntarily. So it comes back to my initial point around balance, openness, trust, and actually going with a plan and saying, this is how I plan to make it work. Will you support me?
Great. And I think sometimes it's easier to do that when we get to a certain level of senior leadership, but we can certainly distill that even if we're at the beginning of our career, and start practicing that and figure out what's important to us to navigate at early stages in our career as well, because it's that constant negotiation and obviously also looking for roles that resonate well. Okay, Christina, I know we're up against time, and I'm going to finish off with 3 takeaways. So it's not enough just to do good. What's your why? Staying curious and channeling passion in the right way. Those are the big ones I've taken away. I'm sure you've got bucket loads more that you can share, but I'm going to say thank you to both of you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure and such a privilege to have this opportunity to speak with you. And I am now going to hand back over to Christina.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining this very fantastic, insightful, very interesting conversation. Thank you to our three speakers, Shahina, Nazarene, and Gwen, for sharing your thought, your experience, and insights on the topic. And we will share with you the recordings of the session in a follow-up email. Thank you everyone for joining, and have a lovely day.
Thank you all.